Again, welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. And thank you for joining us. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Jessie Anderson. I'm a senior conflict advisor sitting in USAID Center for Resilience. And I'm going to be moderating us today. And before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping points. So we can head to the next slide. Perfect. Now, this is a feature I personally have not used before, and I think it's super neat. So this event is being conducted in both English and French. And so you just want to make sure that you choose your preferred language, either English or French, by clicking this globe icon that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So once you click on that interpretation globe, you're going to be able to select your language. And from there, you can mute the original audio or follow at a lower volume. It might be nicer to mute the original audio. So if you have any problems accessing that interpretation function or any other tech issues, please reach out in the chat. And also, because I know I'm speaking in English, we're going to put a link in the chat box to access the French version as well. Perfect. So this event, just for a little background, is organized by REAL, the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning Award. This is a consortium-led effort funded by the USAID Center for Resilience, and REAL is implemented by Save the Children, Food for the Hungry, Mercy Corps, and Tango International. And you can learn more about REAL from the webpage, which we can drop in the chat. And we can head to the next slide. Perfect. So I'm just going to give a really high-level overview of our agenda today, which I'm super excited about. So the reason we're here is together to be discussing these key takeaways from a rapid learning series brief on risk analysis and crisis contexts with a focus on DRC. And this is part of a broader rapid learning series through REAL that we hope you attend the other sessions we have for the other briefs. And we're really looking forward to the conversation today. So to have this session together, we're going to have a presentation from Mercy Corps' Jim Arbogast and Olga Petriniak first. They'll be going through some really great key takeaways from the brief, as well as crisis analytics work in general. After that, we're going to head into a moderated panel with our presenters. So we'll keep them on stage, but then we also have additional colleagues coming from DRC with us. So we have Mercy Corps' Fagaye Sanko, and then Onesphore Bangenza, and USAID's Taylor Garrett. And then after that, we will open up to Q&A from all of you. So we can head to the next slide. Now, in a second, we'll be moving on to the presentations and we'll be hearing from Olga and Jim. But before that, we are going to share a quick poll with you all. And we're going to give folks about 2 minutes to answer these. So this first question is about, do you have the analytical tools you need to be predicting evolving shocks and stresses in conflict settings? And then the second question is, are your analytical tools in conflict settings being used effectively to support resilience interventions across humanitarian development and peace investments? So we'll give folks a minute or two to answer those, and then we'll share out the results. Okay, I think our results are in, and it's just interesting to see these before we head into the presentation. Oh, more folks are chiming in though. But it's interesting to see that about a fifth of you, do think that you have these tools. It'll be super interesting to hear more about that in the Q&A as well. But most folks fall into the no or somewhat camp for for the first question. And then we're seeing a lot of somewhat with the second question too. Can you use those analytics to be working across humanitarian development peace? And quite a bit of no too. So that'll be really interesting to hear one way or the other when we get to the open Q&A. And actually we'll hear some great responses to these themes in the moderated panel as well. Awesome. Thank you everyone for participating with that. And with that, and to kick us off, I'm now going to turn over to Jim Arbogast, Senior Director for Crisis Analytics, as well as Mercy Corps' Olga Petriniak, Senior Director for Global Resilience and Food Security. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I really admire this work. So thank you very much, Jim and Olga, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. And hello, everyone. I'll kick us off quickly. Jim and I will be sharing this presentation today, but I wanted to start by setting the scene a little bit today, just providing some background on how we landed on this topic of discussing analytics and resilience as an area of exploration and how they are related. So just about 3 years ago, we embarked on this new work stream under the REAL Award in partnership with USAID to more carefully examine how we work in humanitarian contexts with a crisis lens, in a humanitarian context defined by conflict with a resilience lens. And the motivation, of course, for this is pretty clear. We know that conflict-driven crises are increasing and they are the primary current driver of humanitarian need. And so we wanted to understand where and how resilience applies, not just in the context of, say, drought or flood or pests, but how it applies in conflict contexts as well. So we asked ourselves a few questions in that regard. Next slide. So we wanted to understand, what are the shocks and stresses defining conflict contexts and how are they different? What resilience capacities or sources of resilience matter most? And what works to support those resilience capacities? Next slide. And traditionally, we've asked those type of questions in any context through kind of our risk and resilience assessment that we've conducted in partnership with USAID in a number of different contexts like Uganda and Nepal. And we have a lot of lessons learned and actually guidance on how to conduct these risk and resilience assessments. But when we first tried to apply it to kind of a conflict setting, we realized this really wasn't the right methodological tool. Next slide, please. So specifically, lessons learned from our first application of a risk and resilience assessment, in a conflict-driven crisis, which was Borno State in Northeast Nigeria, demonstrated that the type of risk and resilience analysis that we were using was really too slow and too cumbersome for the evolving nature of shocks and stresses in a conflict context. I mean, this is, of course, maybe pretty intuitive, but it was revealing at the time that when we look at a conflict context, we know that irrespective of root causes, a single episode of violence, which is a shock in itself, can lead to a rapidly cascading effect of other shocks, restrictions of movement, blockades, food shortages, market disruptions. And these shocks are evolving very rapidly and the specific dynamics changing even more rapidly. And sort of this preventing the ability of program interventions to really keep up with these dynamics. Next slide. So I won't go into the details of kind of our resilience and conflict framework here, but in short, the lesson was that if we wanted to better strengthen resilience capacities in crisis setting, first to help people cope and adapt to the long-term effects of conflict, but also to anticipate and prevent shocks that evolve from conflict and ultimately emerge from it, we needed better analytics. We needed sort of more granular, rapid forms of analysis. And this motivated us to look into rapid situational analysis, something that's often used in humanitarian contexts, and see if it can be better applied to resilience-oriented programming and kind of go beyond the humanitarian community. And we use a case study of Mercy Corps' application of this type of methodology, which is crisis analytics in DRC. And I'll hand it over to Jim to talk a little bit more about what is crisis analytics.
Thanks, Olga. And we can move to, So what we call crisis analytics at Mercy Corps, I think, really needs a bit of clarification. Different terms are used by different organizations, and even within Mercy Corps. This whole initiative started by humanitarian access teams with the Syria response in 2014, 2015. Then globally, we moved towards humanitarian analysis, which was a reflection of a wider scope of our analysis teams, and finally landed into crisis analytics about 2 years ago, which was again a reflection of an evolution of the analysis as we do it within the organization, and which is increasingly integrating quantitative analysis and more quantitative data. So Mercy Corps crisis analytics teams basically aggregate and analyze data in almost real time in order to improve decision making and access in complex crises. That's our main objective, is to feed within this decision making process, programmatic decision making process, to improve our program design and implementation. So we are layering information from primary sources. We do collect data and information directly in the field through networks of field researchers. This is completed by open source data and increasingly by quantitative data through our partnership with Amazon Web Services. We integrate programmatic data and combine this with analysis by subject matter experts. And this analysis is really grounded in Mercy Corps status as an operational organization. And actually, if I was disclosing a map of our presence today, you would see that we cover only countries where Mercy Corps is operational, and our biggest operations in protracted crisis. You will see that our main target, our main audience, is an internal one. So we really work together with our programs, and we are mainly a demand-driven analysis service in the way that we are responding to a demand coming from our country teams, from our program teams. So we mainly work for Mercy Corps programs, for our partners also, when that's relevant. We feed directly into our wider country policy and advocacy objectives, and then we try and share a bit what we can with the wider humanitarian response, or with the wider community in the crisis where we work. We also share our work with embassies, donors, think tank, and influencers. But I would say that most of our products are usually made for an internal audience. Next slide, please. So what does crisis analytics has to offer? Quite a wide range of products. Obviously, we provide context updates, periodic reports. We also do deep dive thematic analysis. We are increasingly working on scenario planning and forecasting, also through new technology. And a specific component of crisis analytics is also providing partner and vendor vetting, what we internally call enhanced due diligence. So all this to strengthen our situational awareness, to strengthen our access in complex situations, and also to feed it directly into our programs, and for our programs to permanently be able to adapt and be agile in the context where they are. Next slide. So what we've been focusing on, so obviously conflict analysis, access and security has, in the early years of crisis analytics, been one of our main focus, doing a lot of analysis of really deep dynamics within conflict areas, a lot of stakeholder mapping, facilitating our access negotiations, a lot of security-related analysis also at the beginning. But with the years and with new demands coming from our program, really the scope of crisis and analytics became more and more wide. So we started looking at governance issues, and more so we started doing more and more economic related analysis, looking at market supply chains. We did, for example, in Yemen, a whole analysis of the fuel supply chain study, fuel supply chain, and how it was impacting on the food security situation in country. We've been looking at the currency fluctuation in Venezuela and how it was affecting livelihoods. We've been doing this kind of more political economy related studies and linking this with our programs, and I'll give a few examples after. We've been working also on migration and displacement, and that's something that we are now taking forward more from a data perspective, and working on trying to build predictive model on displacement, especially in Nigeria and in DRC, actually. Next slide. So a few examples of what we've been doing recently, and again, really combining and articulating the use of quantitative data together with qualitative data, which is gathered in the field. We've developed a food price prediction model in Syria. So working with our tech partner AWS. Based on data which is available from WFP and FAO, we are now able to predict prices of basic food items with a 4-month perspective and a level of 88% accuracy, which is quite accurate. And this has been really now integrated into the programming cycle, our livelihood programming cycle in Syria. A few other things that we've been doing is using nightlight reflectance to estimate electricity consumption, population density, and economic output. That's something that we are looking at replicating in Lebanon, for example. And more recently, we've been measuring agricultural water stress. Based on the changes in vegetation water content, to assess the impact of drought also in Syria. So these are a few examples of the work we've been doing, and I think that's giving a bit of an overview of this evolution of analysis from purely conflict analysis to a wider humanitarian analysis that can really feed it not only into our humanitarian programming, but more into our long-term programming. Next slide. So now, why did we pick up DRC as a case study? That's because of the size of this portfolio for Mercy Corps, but also because of the breadth of products that the DRC analysis team was offering. As you can see here, the team, which has been created in 2019 and integrated into our humanitarian programs department, with a focus on displacement in order for Mercy Corps to position itself to respond to population movement. The team has been producing displacement alerts, a lot of situation reports, as you can see, monthly or weekly, some scenario planning reports, context evaluations, some political analysis, perception trackers, and that's something we'll come back to, and some markets built which are done in collaboration with Rich. So that's because of this offering of product and services that DRC was picked up as an example, and also because of a reflection and thinking in the country office around resilience and triple nexus programming. Olga?
Thanks a lot, Jim. So I wanted to now just kind of do a deep dive into the DRC case study and really understand what kind of data was being produced and how that did or did not influence our programming. So again, just a deeper understanding of how the use of these rapid predictive analytical models may or may not support more resilience-oriented interventions in humanitarian contexts. Next slide. So just quickly, the analysis of the crisis analytics team in the DRC looked into a series of questions around to what extent the information produced really helped teams anticipate or better understand shocks, whether that understanding helped shape interventions that help program participants cope, adapt, prevent the escalation of crisis. And we looked into 3 cases of crisis use cases specifically. And so I wanted to share some of the findings there, which at least we find really interesting, and hopefully you will too. Next slide. So in Eastern DRC, the crisis analytics team, they're called the SHA, the Congo Humanitarian Analysis Team, was monitoring and responding to what was perceived to be frequent displacement of multiple populations over a short period of time. And following an initial analysis of one of the situations, the SHA was actually able to ascertain that, contrary to sort of popular understanding, many of these populations were not actually being displaced as frequently as was understood, but in many cases they were staying in the places where they were going to for 9 months, 12 months, even for more periods of time. And they were going not to villages where they didn't know anybody, but in places where they actually had a strong social connections and maybe shared strong cultural ties. So they were not settling in areas that were sort of unfamiliar to them and where they had no recourse. Rather, they were settling in places that were characterized by ethnic and language similarities, shared trade, often strong social or familial ties. And why was this important is because, the initial response to displacement was often that we need shelter or NFIs, when in this case, there was an understanding that we needed mechanisms that could actually support local livelihoods among these populations and help to strengthen bonds with existing communities and their host communities that they actually had these strong relationships with. So the initial interventions switched from direct goods provision to provision of cash that allowed for greater market participation and reciprocity of these really important social connections that were in themselves a source of resilience. And while that was an important pivot in itself, there was an observation that perhaps the SHA underutilized some of this data and could have gone even more deeply into understanding local market dynamics to better help build out market interventions related to displacement. So again, just an example of how, without this deeper understanding of what was happening under the surface, the response may have been sort of guided by a short-term humanitarian vision without sort of looking at how to support these critical sources of resilience in this context. Next slide. So kind of the takeaway from that was this continuous and granular analysis of displacement can provide a clearer picture of what is possible for humanitarian investments to go beyond meeting immediate needs and start thinking about more medium-term programming. Next slide. So this is actually one of my personal favorite cases. It's around, in terms of use of data, and related to the Ebola outbreak in Eastern DRC, where Mercy Corps, together with partners, established a perception survey tracker to combat the spread of rumors and misinformation related to the Ebola outbreak. Now, we know that Ebola was a compounding crisis, not only because the disease itself created major disruptions, but because the misinformation further weakened people's capacity to effectively cope with the crisis, and because that misinformation actually fueled further violence and created kind of a deeper backsliding into conflict. So this perception tracker was able to understand the specific sources of misinformation. For example, in one case, a village leader in Ituri had influenced a young group of people, actually a very functional youth group, to broadly disseminate his particular perception of Ebola and to spread that misinformation. Now, because we understood the source of the misinformation and understood the vector of the misinformation, we were actually then able to target that very specifically, and then partner with the youth group around awareness raising and a counter misinformation campaign. So not just stopping the dangerous rumors, but actually strengthening local institutional capacity in the response to this crisis. Similarly, in Benin, we learned that just the very words Mercy Corps and our donor UPTAKE in this particular case were triggering words. Mercy Corps was interpreted with the French pronunciation as dead bodies, UPTAKE as Al-Qaeda. We understood that there were rumors spreading around potentially us being a dangerous organization. And again, by understanding both the source and the vector of misinformation, even related to an agency like ours, we were able to build partnerships that countered that and actually created stronger bonds and ultimately supported a more community-led Ebola information campaign. So strengthening local sources of resilience in that way. Next slide. So just the kind of key insight here was that this ability to consistently monitor the pulse of the community in a crisis context and counter negative perceptions not only allowed for life-saving interventions to happen, but also strengthened partnerships with community structures, supported conflict-sensitive interventions, and thus kind of strengthened an enabling environment for resilience. Next slide. So the third and final case linked to also the use of sort of deep dive displacement analysis in Benin and Ituri, which through this analysis, we were able to correctly predict the movement of armed actors over a period of 5 months. So there were a number of, speak a bit slower for the interpreter, sorry. I saw a chat come through, apologies. So the third and final case was linked to the use of not just displacement alerts, but deep dive displacement, an analysis of deep dive displacement dynamics. And through that, we were able to also understand the movement of armed actors over a period of 4 to 5 months. I believe there were 5 potential scenarios that were put forward and 3 of them were realized. This analysis of the movement of armed groups, where they were going, what the likely outcome would be, was widely shared with humanitarian donors and other actors, and was effectively used to preposition funding and supplies, deploy staff for the emergency response. But what didn't happen is that this information was actually not shared more broadly with peace and development actors. And understanding the nature of the information right now, we saw that there was some missed opportunities in potentially looking, if we worked with actors working in other programming, we could have looked at opportunities to seek dialogue or negotiation. We potentially could have laid the groundwork for engagement with host communities, given the displacement that was coming. We could have potentially understood potential threats to market dynamics and provided assistance to kind of support economic and business continuity in the face of these armed movements. So because we didn't sort of include other actors and bring other actors to the table to make use of this information, potentially we saw this case as a missed opportunity to really strengthen, laying the groundwork for resilience and strengthening resilience capacities among local populations. So I'll stop there, I believe. Oh, sorry, I think I just have one last slide on key lessons. Next slide, just go a little faster. Overall, some of the key lessons that came out through these case studies in the DRC specifically was that this type of information was not just relevant only for humanitarian actors, but peace and development implementers as well, and could steer collective action. Importantly, the methodology was seen as providing clear value add to existing humanitarian situational analysis, because it didn't just focus on the occurrence of certain factors, but on motivations, on causes, and the systemic implications. But because the information was not as widely distributed as it could have been, it suggested a missed opportunity for strengthening resilience. Next slide. So really quickly, before handing it back over to Jim to share kind of some of the key recommendations and going into our panel, just a couple of questions for all of you. Just in terms of what you heard, does this type of data feel important in terms of its ability to support resilience programs in conflict contexts? And what's your thoughts on how critical it might be to invest in this kind of risk and resilience analytics? Okay, so it looks like the poll results are being shared and no one said it's not relevant, so that's good. And most of you, there seems to be a general majority, 67% seeing that it's both important and critical, and another 33% at somewhat relevant and somewhat critical. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jim to close the presentation and we can go into our panel and Q&A.
Thanks, Olga. I'm happy to see this result and to see that no one is saying it's not relevant. Can we go to next slide? Yeah, so we took a few recommendations from this case study. There was also a wider study which was carried at the same time on how crisis analytics is impacting on our Mercy Corps programs, but that remains an internal report. But a few recommendations for the wider community. The first one, and that's something we are currently trying to move forward, is that crisis analytics, or what we call crisis analytics at Mercy Corps, but there are other terms used in the sector, should be an essential component of Nexus programs decision making in conflict context. And that's I think that's really a critical one. It's like how do we integrate analysis really into our program? And that's a bit of a wider issue, and there are different things that we are exploring with a better structural integration of our crisis analytics team within our wider program teams, for example, but also in terms of creating awareness, creating links between analysis teams, which are sometimes also composed of non-traditional profiles for the sector, and how do we connect these analysis teams with our program teams, and not only humanitarian but also our resilience programming teams. Next slide. So the second one is a bit always an obvious, is that we need the funding to be available for crisis analytics to be funded, and also crisis analytics hubs, not just only organization per organization, but there is more and more joint analysis or opportunities for joint analysis that could be funded. A few things have been tried, like for example the conflict sensitivity platform for Yemen. There was one which was also planned in the Sahel. All these initiatives should be really supported by the donor community, in the sense that they participate to the knowledge within the sector, that they provide relevant, actionable, real-time crisis data for the different actors across the nexus. Next slide. Incorporation of crisis analysts into program budget and connecting them into our assessment and monitoring teams is really something that helps shape and gather more granular information. That's also a really core one. What we've seen in our organization is that sometimes crisis analytics is brought on at a later stage or a bit too late in the process, and that resources for the gathering and analysis of information was not always built into program and into budget, and this is like creating delays and gaps in our programming cycle. Next slide. And this last recommendation is really about how do we disseminate crisis analysis, and the necessity to leverage existing coordination structure to better share information and analysis within the humanitarian and development system. Mercy Corps is one organization producing analysis. Others are also doing the same, and this analysis remains very often internal, not widely shared, and remains a bit of a niche. There is a need to use the existing coordination mechanism. So this analysis is first not duplicated in terms of efficiency, and then really creates a body of knowledge which is accessible to the wider community at crisis level. Next slide. Yeah, and now we can go into our panel discussion. Thank you.
Jim and Olga, thank you so much for that. I don't want to speak for the audience, but I think the examples you gave are just so compelling. I think, you know, those issues around displacement dynamics and what do we need to know to link that to longer term investments, and then also the misinformation piece. I mean, I feel like these are the things we hear over and over that folks are grappling with, and to have those, you know, I just think is yeah, super compelling, and I'm very grateful for the presentation. So thank you to you both. And we're now at our moderated panel. We're keeping Jim and Olga on the stage, so to speak, but then we have a couple new folks joining us. So first we have Fageye Sanko, who's the manager for Mercy Corps' Congo Humanitarian Analysis team, as well as Onesphore Bengenza with Mercy Corps DRC as well. And then joining us from USAID, we have BHA's, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is Taylor Garrett. So I'll be asking a number of questions to folks. Also, I know that some folks joined a little later, so I wanted to just flag the interpretation feature, which will matter for this section. There is, I kind of showed my joy about it earlier. There's this feature that I'm not used to in Google Meet, where at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a globe where you can pick English or French. Please pick English for English interpretation, French for French interpretation, and that'll just help you enjoy the moderated panel up ahead. Okay, and then I'll also just flag too that we'll be heading into the open Q&A after this session. So please, you know, if you have questions in mind, feel free to start putting them in the chat. Yeah, and we're looking forward to getting you in on this conversation shortly too. Okay, so my first question is for Onesphore, and we're going to really just kind of ground this into talking more about what this has looked like in DRC and what the team is finding on the ground. So my first question for Onesphore is, you know, how did your team leverage the Congo crisis analytics, and where did you personally find the most value in using this information?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I'll try to give some answers. We find the value for the Congo analysis because the Congo analysis has different products, and some of the product, for example, political bulletin that the Congo analysis is sharing, and the analysis notes that is sharing are often used in the proposal development, and especially for to make a context analysis when we are doing we are writing a proposal. And this same product is also used in the indicator monitoring plan under the data sources. For example, I can give an example. If you have an indicator talking about the percentage of people who can be able to state that in the community they are peaceful, safe, and secure, we can use the additional information, qualitative data from Congo analysis, and we can get the perception on the security and the safety, and this can help us as data to verify some indicators. And during the implementation, also the product among the product of Congo HATS, there is a product on earlier warning, what we call in French alert précoce. This information on the population movement and the security situation, once the information is sharing by the Congo HATS, the team, the program team could adjust the program activities if the alert is in the about the population movement and the security situation in the intervention zone in area. if the alert is a security alert and is continued, the work plan also should be revised accordingly. For example, those in DRC, we have the rapid response program team. They are using the alerts for making the assessment. Once the alert is done, they can plan to do a need assessment and they plan a response in the where the alert has been given. And what I want to emphasize here is what Jim says is the use of perception, community perception tracker. This was very useful during the Ebola outbreak. As you know, from the beginning of the outbreak, there was some messages in the community, and we found that some of the messages was not adapted. But when we start using the community perception tracker, we were able to get other information and all to correct the messages. For example, during this outbreak, most of the time you see people, they were saying the Ebola is not a disease, or they say Ebola is a business for humanitarian agencies. And then we can try to find answer for this and involve, for example, the health centers and to make a good answer. And we just go back to the community and they try to give a feedback. And this feedback, we vehiculate the message either through the radio. We invite, for example, the health of centers or the coordinations on the Ebola, and then they can broadcast some messages that can help people to understand. And during also the COVID, we extend the perceptions tracker on but with different questions. This is some of the questions that of the topics that show the value of the Congo has. Thank you for this. If there is any question, I'm able to respond.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll get folks in the Q&A too that want to follow up. I know the community perceptions tracker is just super interesting to me. And I know we're a little tight on time with all these questions I want to ask. So I am going to hop to the Gaye. So to you, I'm interested in understanding, what factors helped your team determine the analysis that would be most important for acting on emerging conflict risks? I'm curious kind of what that recipe was for you. So over to you.
Okay, bonjour à tous. Je vais répondre en français.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to answer in French. So we have a team, as you said, the conflict, the DRC is a very protracted conflict. We have a team that is mainly from Congo, so which has a professional experience with the crisis, and they see based on experience the early warning signs of the crisis. And so for displaced populations, we have a team or network of key informants on the field who are trained to be able to see what are the crisis early warning signals. Another factor is a recurrent event, so we can follow the situation in Eastern Congo on a daily basis, and we have precisely this classified information in a database, which allows us to define certain tendencies. In that regard, technology is of great help to us because on more macro data and the use of technology allows us to define tendencies with more broader data. We need programs on the field, and our analysis needs to be useful to these programs. So it will be based on crisis analysis to be able to adapt our response or be able to respond to the crisis. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm going to hop back to Onesphore for a second and just kind of pivot our thinking towards the future a bit. So it was wonderful to hear more about what it's looked like for you to use this data so far. I'm wondering, you're a program leader, you're coordinating activity for multiple programs in a dynamic zone with both humanitarian and development programming. What do you foresee your teams in the future using crisis analysis to better coordinate their work, with that focus on humanitarian and development?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think currently for those maybe I didn't, I'm having a position of area manager. I'm covering the Beni and the Ituri territoria, which is the territoria where there's the conflicts and the armed groups. I think the security analysis for each office is enhanced by the reports and the analytic from the Congo HAT. And we are planning to work close with the team. And I'm very happy that FAGE has already appointed staff in Beni, and we are now working close. And also the Congo HAT will continue conduct analysis for understanding of the conflict and the crisis dynamic in the East DRC, and especially in our intervention zone. I think this is, we have also a development project, we have a PDEC, and we use tailored chart analysis for operation planning and the program adaptation and the shared information with the other, our other member of the consortium through different channels. And as I'm in the Beni, we have also, we need also some political, economic analysis from Congo HAT. This is one of the products that we can be using, and we request it, and we coordinate with the Congo HAT to make sure that we have it in place. This is a zone that there is a population movement, and we need that Congo HAT will be continuing to make the alerts in several zones, because this alert will help us, will allow us to continue provide some assistance in the community. And what I can say that we ask Congo HAT, we need that Congo HAT to continue not only just from the beginning of the alert, but continue to provide the monitoring of the conflict in our intervention zone. This will help us from the beginning. We need the Congo HAT to be part of our program that will help us to continue monitoring the dynamic of the conflict in our intervention zone. And it's very, very important just to make sure that we are not exposed, or we are really we are responding where there is a need. Thank you.
Thank you, Onesphore. That's super helpful. I have, with that future orientation, I have one last question for FAGE, and then we'll turn to Taylor and Olga and Jim in a second. And that's around advice that you might have for folks in the room. So, what advice do you have for teams that are looking to set up a crisis analytics unit? Ideally, again, not just to set it up, but then also to be informing programming across humanitarian development piece. Yeah, thanks in advance for whatever advice you have for the crew.
D'accord. Je pense que j'insiste.
I think that I would insist on the composition of the team. You need to recruit a team that really is aware of the local context, preferably a team who has experience and comes from that zone or region, because we have a different method, and also to put it into experimental context, and it helps the analysis and see the relevance of the analysis and archive data in order to create institutional memory, because the Nexus is based on a several-year project, and ensure a presence of the analysis teams during decision-making processes to see what's being discussed and know the actors and give them and know what their information gaps to be able to make up for this gap, and also to be able to position and share an analysis which is useful to the needs expressed by the development community. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn to Taylor to get a USAID perspective on this conversation. So Taylor, first, thank you so much for joining us. My question is, what is your take on what the current thinking is within the mission around investing in this kind of crisis analytics? And from your perspective, drawing from experience elsewhere as well, what do you think it'll take to scale this work? What would be those steps or factors that could help this scale up? So thanks again for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you for having me. I think it's a really good question. I think in the DRC right now, there's no shortage of analytics, no shortage of data. We have, I made a list here. We have the IPC, we have FuseNet, we have REACH, we have our own third-party monitoring, we have the Congo analytics that Mercy Corps does, we have DTM, we have OCHA. We have a lot of different tools that are out there. And I think that I've admired the work that Mercy Corps has done, because it does attempt to be cohesive and comprehensive. And I think that that's a big important part of effective analytics in this situation, is how well are we telling the story of the population, not just a window of their lives, but as we accompany them through whatever happens, how are we telling that story for them? And I think the Mercy Corps work in the analytics does a pretty good job of that. Not that the others don't, but I think for the conflict work that we do specifically in BHA, I think the Mercy Corps work is really effective. I think, and that goes to sort of what I think makes this successful in our work, is the utility of this in our work is how it can accompany the populations that we assist as they, whether it's humanitarian, whether it's rapid response, whether it's resilience building, a lot of these are the same communities, and they're going through the same problems. They won't accept that label. It's not appropriate to give it to them. They see themselves on a roller coaster, not on an escalator. And they appreciate the organizations that stick with them. And I think having these analytics makes it easier to do that. And when under pressure, when your scope of vision gets very small, having the kind of work that Mercy Corps has done is very helpful to figure out what to do next. And I think that's what's going to make this relevant. We are happy to be involved with the Mercy Corps work on this, and I think we're trying to see it used elsewhere in our own portfolio with BHA. I'll be honest, we have not fully explored its potential in other parts of the resilience work that the mission does. I don't see any reason why we can't, but I wouldn't want to mislead you into thinking that we're using this extensively just yet outside of the humanitarian space. But I think it shows potential, and we'd like to try. Thank you. And a big props to Fagé and the team for their work on this. They are really all-stars, and we really appreciate everything they do. So merci beaucoup.
Taylor, thanks. First of all, thanks a lot for those words, but also that perspective. And I think in terms of, where this can be going, seeing the promise and what are we learning from it, it pivots nicely. I'm going to go back to Olga to wrap us up with the moderated panel, and Jim, please chime in too, as you'd like. I'm curious, because this case study focuses on DRC, I'm curious what your team has taken away from this process from a global level. How is it, shifting what you do or how you work, and what are some of those kind of like global learning takeaways that you're gleaning from this process. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. Well, I will start with the fact that we are still in early stages of disseminating and really digesting the information for ourselves. But I think there are some pivots that we're beginning to make, and some next steps that are emerging. And one of the, I actually wanted to pick up on what Taylor said around communities being on sort of a roller coaster and not an escalator. But I do, and I think this is why it's so critical for this type of information, and why we as Mercy Corps are starting to really look at how we can move crisis analytics out of purely the humanitarian realm and really start to connect it to resilience or development or peace investments, because hopefully that will allow us to more cohesively support communities as they're moving through these various areas. And when they are on the upper side of the roller coaster, is there something that we can do to ensure that they don't fall back down as much, or that we can kind of at least continue some level of an upward trajectory, even though there's going to be backsliding. And so that's been a real focus for us. And as Onesphora mentioned, one of the things that we're doing in even in DRC is moving that analytics out from the humanitarian realm and now looking at PDEC, which is actually a large USAID-funded program that looks at resilience, governance, conflict management systems, and how can some of this analytics be used to inform those longer-term interventions, or have more of a complementary and reinforcing programming between the humanitarian and development investments. We've also moved the analytical we're starting to look at how to move crisis analytics out of just purely humanitarian, they were sitting under humanitarian teams, and now look at how they can sit sort of at a country level as an analytical structure that more closely connects to programs. But I will also say that, and I'm sorry to say to our programs more broadly. Another thing that I think we're learning and grappling with is what are the most important dynamics and indicators to track depending on the context. And, in DRC, we talked a lot about displacement. We talked a lot about rumor and perception tracking. And I think those will be highly relevant in most contexts. But there are other dimensions of sort of crisis context that we're looking at. So, for example, in certain parts of East Africa, we're starting to look at how might we apply this type of predictive analytics and shock modeling to, say, the livestock sector and livestock mobility. Livestock trade being such an important, underlying factor in the East Africa livestock economy. How can we understand how shocks, conflict and non-conflict shocks affect that trade, affect animal movement, and what does that mean for how we shape our intervention? So looking at how do we apply this analysis to other factors, and what other types of indicators do we have to look at? The final thing that I will say in terms of global learning, I think as an agency, we're just slowly moving away from this idea that, you do an assessment and then you program and then you do an evaluation. That assessment is something, it seems intuitive and we all talk about it, but we don't often do it. We think that we're going in with a major assessment. Once we analyze everything, we're going to know everything we're going to do for the next 1 year or 2 years. And something that this kind of analytical models are really putting forward for us is that this is something we should be applying across the board in a number of different programs and a number of different dimensions. And we need to see context monitoring or rapid context monitoring as part and parcel of what we do. If we're really going to build resilience, if we're going to work on kind of medium and longer term programming, we need to be able to kind of rapidly take the pulse of the context, look at predictive models more appropriately, not just understand the what, but also the how, the underlying reasons behind it, so we can meaningfully shape program interventions. So I'll stop there.
Olga, thank you. That was super. And I'll just say, so we're going to round the bend now. We're going from our moderated panel. So thank you to all of our panelists, but also your work is not done. I'm keeping you all for the open Q&A as well. We're now going to turn to the open Q&A, and we have received some super thoughtful questions from the crew. The first actually is something that Olga, you just touched on, but I don't know if Olga and Jim, but then actually anyone else would like to chime in on this. And so this is coming from Jennifer Karsner, and she's asking, how tailored is the crisis analytics methodology? Could it be modified to be specific towards IDPs and IDP camps, for instance? And then she says, based on the first slide, it seems like a yes. So I don't know, the livestock example was super helpful. I don't know if you want to elaborate on how it can be tailored and just what some of the thinking is there for folks who are interested. But then we can also head over to some other questions. Thanks.
Well,
Jim, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can. I can provide some insights here. I mean, the easy answer to the question is yes, it can be tailored to specific programmatic needs. Any kind of specific programmatic needs. Actually, one of the advantage of this crisis analytics model that we are using is its flexibility. It's also going with sometimes with some challenges in terms of standardization, for example. But it's a very flexible model which we permanently adapt to the needs of our country program. For example, what the team in Syria is doing is not exactly as what the team in Yemen does. And we've been sometimes very specific. For example, we did work in northern Mozambique under a big program that under a consortium that Mercy Corps was leading, and all the work we did in northern Mozambique was about analyzing drivers of radicalization, for example. So the team was not doing anything else than this, and that was really tailored to the need of the program. So yes, and it's and after it's always like identifying what do we need to know, and then when it's coming to us, it's are we going to answer to the questions you have, and then it's a matter of the how you're making it happen, and how do you set up your crisis analytics team, and etc. But yes, in general, very flexible and adaptable.
I might just add really quickly, Jesse, that I think that the real crux of this being effective, and I think that, as we evolve also in our methodologies we're working on, is, that we think about not just what we want to know, but how we're going to use it, and really being clear about sort of the use of the data and its application. And so like now we're starting to revise and reimagine the process of how the analytics teams work in very close partnership with the program teams to get a really deep understanding of the type of rapid information they might need, how does that link to their programming, and what decisions they might be able to make as a result. So that partnership across the analytics team and the programs team is really essential, and how that process is run and facilitated is crucial to ensuring that the data is used in an effective way.
Awesome, Olga and Jim, thank you. And this next question, I think, is super thoughtful, and I don't think it's something we've heard about yet. This comes from Carolina, and she's asking, what are the risks for affected populations related to sharing some of the findings? For instance, maybe prediction of displacement with a wider audience. So, data is excellent and helps us plan, but then there's these conflict sensitivity concerns too about what does it mean to be sharing this information. And then she's asking, and what would be the suggested mitigation measures, and/or maybe there's mitigation measures that you all have have attempted already. So, I thought this was a super question. I might see if Onesphore or Fagay want to chime in, and then, but really it's open to everyone because I think this is kind of a collaborative question for folks to be thinking about. So yeah, Onesphore or Fagay, over to you, and then Olga and Jim, please chime in as well.
Ok. Merci pour la question. Pour le moment, nous, on
Thanks for the question. Right now, we are operating with the DRC on the mailing list. Mainly, we have international organizations who receive our analysis. Along with, we think these analyses will not be shared. There is a communal responsibility to use this data and just for their own purposes and not to share it. And so we have a displacement alert, which is public, and the information shared there remain strictly essential to the humanitarian response and and we're very careful regarding information that could have protection issues. I think it's the same with all the analysis teams. I don't know if the other Jim or anybody else want to report on this.
It's really an important, this question of risk exposure is really an important one. Risk exposure of the populations affected, or the population in the area where we work, and also the risk exposure of our own teams, because this kind of activities in conflict setting is obviously going with certain sensitivities. So just to say that, one is that generally speaking, when we set up a new team, a new crisis analytics team, there is a full risk assessment which is conducted for the setup of this capacity, which is conducted in close coordination with our security department, obviously, and the exposure of communities to our analytical work is part of this risk assessment, and then a number of mitigation measures are defined, whether it's about the way we profile the team, the way we disseminate products. Just to mention that most of our analytical products which are shared outside Mercy Corps are not shared under Mercy Corps brand for obvious reasons, and not shared through Mercy Corps platforms or Mercy Corps email addresses, etc. So for each team, there is a risk assessment, there are mitigation measures, there are plans in place, and then for specific products, and sometimes going into the level of specific information, then we have specific risk-related discussions about whether to share, not to share a document, whether to share, not to share a document, information. There have been situations where we've been, for example, able to predict or forecast military operations, movements, which were going to have consequences on populations in certain affected areas, and we have ways to share this kind of information, which will not expose the populations we are trying to help. I hope that answered the question, but that's a very good point.
Je voulais en fait souligner et renforcer.
I wanted to underscore and focus on the fact that people who work in a consortium, in order to be able to share data, we need to have a data sharing agreement and a protocol with them, but also for the risk compared within the community, certain message and information often are validated by state structures, and these are messages for public health, and we invite either the head doctor in the region, and we talk about the feedback and the response to provide to the community. And once it's been validated by the administrative authority, we can give a feedback via radio or other communication modules and to go to the community. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
Everyone, thanks so much for those replies. I have another really easy question coming up. I think it's excellent, actually. And it's really about, this is from Joanna Springer. It's really about what this looks like within an organizational system, kind of what's the architecture, how would these things nest and fit together? So Joanna asks, she'd like to hear more about recommendations for streamlining and coordinating with the MEL and CLA approaches in a resilience program. So she says, it sounds like the crisis analytics team draws on some MEL data. In turn, would adaptive management decisions be streamlined through the MEL CLA process that might already be existing? For instance, around scenario planning, use of context indicators to trigger different scenarios, et cetera, or would it be managed separately? And then she asks, would the crisis analytics team draw on an initial conflict analysis managed by the project team, or would they work with different parameters information? So lots of questions that to me, but Joanna, also feel free to clarify, really get at the how does this work from a systems perspective? How would you kind of weave it in with existing MEL, CLA, and data related approaches. And I think, please feel free to chime in both from what has happened versus what you might think an ideal state could look like. So, and honestly, I'm not doing a great job at punting these to specific people. I might start with Jim, then Olga for thoughts on this, maybe more at that global level, but then it would be awesome to hear from Anas Forfagay in terms of what it has looked like to manage this on the ground. So Jim, over to you first, and then others please chime in.
Well, I'm sure that Olga will have a more comprehensive answer than me from a resilience perspective. But this connection between crisis analytics and MEL was at the beginning of crisis analytics, not something like obvious, and that's really something that we had to build over the years. First, in terms of use of data, crisis analytics using MEL data, but MEL teams also using crisis analytics as a resources. And more recently, at global level, we've been discussing more and more how we can support country offices to better integrate or coordinate the work that is done between the crisis analytics teams and the MEL teams. And Olga was mentioning the PDEC program before. We are actually currently discussing with the MEL team about a pilot under the PDEC program where the crisis analytics teams would help MEL to track scenarios. I mean, we are at early stages of the discussion, so we don't have like yet terms of reference for it. But this is the kind of thing that we are looking at, and I also think that Fagaye could give a good example with what's being developed under our SWASA program also, which is I believe very relevant to the question.
Sorry, Jim.
I can follow up with another. Oh, go figure, please.
Sorry, excuse me. Jim,
désolé. Alors, la fin de votre remarque, qu'est-ce qui est développé avec SWASA? En ce qui regarding the work with MEL, the same thing regarding the data protection. First of all, we could use data, MEL data, but also the data is only collected for program evaluation and assessment, and then it becomes a bit more complex for us. As Jim says, you always have opportunity.
Concernant SWASA, on est en train de faire un suivi en fait des hypothèses du programme. Donc, chaque programme fait son cadre logique, et pour les aider en fait à s'adapter aux potentielles crises dans les zones où ils vont intervenir, on va faire
intervention zones. We will do a follow-up, be on the political, economical, or social context to allow them to, during their 5-year program, to adapt their intervention, adapt their strategies, and we can also have a counseling role on the strategy adaptation and how to interact with various players in the field. An example, indeed, of the type of support that we can have during the project follow-up. For UPTAKE, it becomes concrete. For UPTAKE, we have indicators which are really clear and which really need support from the chat, Congo hat. We need indicators that needs a verification on the basis on the market analysis. And for instance, you have qualitative and quantitative data which could be produced. And as I mentioned previously during the presentation, we have indicators regarding safety, which need in the specific zone in order to have qualitative data and PDEC indicators. And in verification sources, we mentioned that we need that we have to work with chat or Congo hat so that we can produce actually information to confirm during concerning such and such indicators, whether it or not it was reached. I believe this becomes very palpable and concrete, and also as far as conflict analysis, because we also work in consortium with UPTAKE, and we would like for the SHA and the international partners with expertise regarding conflict data and data sensitivity. And so we need to have a synergy among partners, consortium partners, and the Congo hat.
Thank you, everyone, for that. I wanted to a little close to the end of our time together. I would say, in addition to the list I have, we probably have time for one to two more questions. So if you have a burning question you haven't asked yet, please feel free to put it in the chat. And then otherwise, I have a couple more to share with our panelists as well. So the next question is actually
Jesse, can I add a... Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Sorry, I thought I caught you in a pause moment. I was just going to add something to the previous answer, if that's okay.
No, please go ahead.
No, sorry about that. I think it's just, you know, what Onesphore described, I think is really important just to underscore, because there's this recent evolution of incorporating crisis analytics into our MEL system, but it wasn't always this way. And I think it's just a general, a bigger picture reflection on how MEL is more structured around things that, you know, we predict we want to know in advance, and sort of crisis analytics is looking ahead of the game. And, you know, it has a completely different structure, right? Our MEL team has MEL team members, whereas crisis analytics has kind of key informants and this big data that it's aggregating and combining. And so they, you know, initially they were part of two completely different structures and two completely different teams. And I think this is just, it's a reflection for me. That's kind of the evolution of the next phase of MEL. Like, this is how we need to be doing MEL in the future in crisis context. And we need to be bringing this kind of information forward front and center into our kind of CLA processes, into our review and reflection meetings. And just, you know, this evolution of this case study actually is what's really allowing us to do that in DRC and in other places. But it's just kind of a reflection of how we might want to rethink MEL more broadly in some of these contexts.
Olga, thanks for hopping in with that. I think that's a really interesting takeaway, that it's actually not about mashing them together in a way that kind of makes sense, but actually maybe about rethinking MEL in and of itself, the way we currently do it. Yeah, I think that's super interesting. Oh, and Joanna is pleased with the replies. So yeah, thank you everyone for engaging on that one. It's an excellent question, Joanna. So our next question is for Taylor. We haven't gotten to hear as much on the panel. So, so thank you, Taylor. This is about sort of USAID, USG perspective from Kyla. She's saying it might be helpful to hear from USAID on whether there are USG barriers to sharing crisis predictor analytics information more widely, and then on the ways we can possibly overcome or work around those barriers. And I'm not sure if the thinking is about bureaucratic barriers, like sectoral bureaucratic barriers, or maybe about, you know, like legal or otherwise barriers. But Taylor, feel free to take it in any direction. Also, Kyla, feel free to clarify. And yeah, thanks again for responding.
Thanks. I mean, I think this is not the only, there are other sources of information that come in about attacks in progress, you know, ambush right now happening against, you know, an NGO in this place, or and I think our Mercy Corps colleagues in the field get those as well. And there's a wealth of info that flows around daily on what's happening, and a lot of it is caveated with this is for a specific purpose. And I think that in the case of the Congo hat, we have treated the information that they prepare for a specific purpose. And that's what they've asked us to do. I think that its applicability in resilience programming, I think it would be applicable in a certain kind of resilience programming, because we do need to accompany communities, and this is important for that accompaniment. For other types of resilience programming, it's probably not going to be as important. So I think it really depends upon the usage that's envisaged for it, who the audience would be and why. And if that's clearly defined, it's probably a different kind of discussion. What I think is critical, and I'm still old-fashioned this way, I guess, but I think it's critical not to repurpose this, not to see it emerge in another format, in another setting. That's not what our partner has asked us to do with it, and that's not what we will do with it. So I think clearly, explicitly knowing the rules of engagement on it with Mercy Corps or any other partner, and then knowing what else it could be used for to facilitate a discussion would be what I would see appropriate next steps. But Jim and Fage and others, I don't know your thoughts. It's about what the partner really feels like is appropriate to do with it as a starting point. And we would go from there, really deferring to their lead, in my view.
I have to say that we are usually indeed the ones who are asking for our products not to be more widely shared, and but that's also always a bit the issue when you are doing analysis within an operational organization. Mercy Corps is here to deliver programs, and analysis is not one of its core activities. I mean, we are not ACAP, so we have to manage this balance between sharing an analysis that we think is useful for the wider community and not only for Mercy Corps, with protecting our staff and protecting our programs.
Jim, thanks for that. And Jennifer, I see your hand is up, so I didn't know. Feel free to hop in. Do you want to hop in on this question, or
yeah.
do you have another?
No, it's because I would say the barrier is not so much on sharing information, but the protection issue has raised its head in Ethiopia, where we have a mechanism, the partner liaison security operation, I think, and there have been some issues where if information leaks, it has come back on their staff, and they've either been detained by police or interrogated, not tortured, just questioned by police. And so we've had to send out numerous reminders that the information that PLSO sends out is absolutely not for wider distribution. But the more you share, the more those protection issues come into play when your situation is very volatile. And so I think that's something that we're very acutely aware of in Ethiopia right now. But the information itself, we do distribute. It's not our barriers. We just have to be very cognizant of protecting the information sources. Over.
Jennifer, thanks for that. And that loops back to the conversation earlier about kind of conflict sensitivity around this data. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that perspective. We have a question and a comment. Actually, Jennifer, both of these are from you. So I'm gonna read the comment first, then ask the question, and then unfortunately our time together is coming to a close, and I'm gonna in a second kind of plug the next in this series because we have a whole set of these events, which is super exciting. So Jennifer just provides a comment. You know, we are in Ethiopia, and the piece on tracking disinformation is very interesting to us. In the resilience space, we have conducted conflict analyses, but this real-time analysis has relevance in the displacement and return space, which is for us also part of resilience. Yeah, that resonates a lot with me, and I just think it comes up in so many of our resilience-focused countries. You know, again, you know, Olga and team, thanks for the examples around displacement dynamics, misinformation. I think it's just really so common and something that so many folks are grappling with in the field. So thank you for that. And then Jennifer has a question for Fage. Fage, did you use the information that was obtained from the staff of the multiple partners, or did you use your staff exclusively? So over to you for that.
On utilise les sources.
We use sources emanating from everywhere, from our staff, but also from other organizations. A lot of organizations which are not specialists in certain subject, for instance, INSO, which provides us with security information that we can use their sources. their security follow-up sources, and we use also reports which are sent and shared by a partner network and which we put in our own database, so we can regroup the information with several levels of credibility levels and several levels of specializations within each topic, security, protection of security, or food security. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. C'est la fin de notre foire aux questions. Merci à tout le monde, les panels et les participants, de leurs questions magnifiques.
Wrapping up. So one, we will be putting in an evaluation in the chat. Please help us improve these future events. This is part of a series by filling out the evaluation. Yeah, your feedback is super helpful. Another just round of gratitude to all of our speakers, all of our presenters and panelists. Thank you so much for making this a really fun hour and a half. I know I really enjoyed it. And then I just want to plug quickly the next event we have in this discussion series. So we'll be diving into what we're learning on social cohesion with a focus on Niger. That will be Tuesday, December 7th. So please stay tuned for more in terms of an invite and to register for that event. And on this slide here too, you can just see a little more about the Resilience and Protracted Crises discussion series in general. And also please feel free to check out the briefs, both especially today's brief on DRC, as well as the rest in this series. And we look forward to having you at the next couple events over the coming months. So with that, a huge thank you again to all the participants, all of our panelists, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.